Percent is a special ratio or fraction where the whole is represented as hundredths, like this grid divided into 100 parts. And this represents one whole part. You could compare the number of purple squares to the total of 100. And there are 66 purple squares, so we could say 66 out of 100. And that would be the same as a fraction, 66 hundredths. Now you'll remember that if you have hundredths and you want to write it as a decimal, that would be 2 decimal places. So you could write 66 hundredths as 0.66. That also is 66 hundredths. Because this is represented out of 100, we could write it as a percent, because percent means out of 100. So we could write this same thing as 66%. These 4 things mean exactly the same thing. They have exactly the same value. 66% is part of a whole. It's not the whole thing. It's only a portion of it. And percent means out of 100. So if you have a fraction like 28 hundredths, again, you could easily write that as a decimal because hundredths is 2 decimal places, 28 hundredths. And because the fraction is out of 100, you can also write it as a percent, 28%. So 28 hundredths is equivalent to 28%. If you're given a percent like 51%, it's easy to convert it to a fraction because you know that percent means out of 100. So you can write it as being out of 100. So you could write it as 51 out of 100, or 51 hundredths. And again, that's easy to convert to a decimal, 51 hundredths. We read them the same. One looks like a percent or a fraction, and one looks like a decimal. And which of these 3 images at the bottom do you think represents 51%? 51% is just slightly more than half. 50 out of 100 is half. 51% would be just slightly more. So if you said the first image on the left, you were probably correct. You were the closest. What about the second image? What percent do you think is represented by the purple in that image? What percent? Well, you know it's less than 50% because it's less than half. So if you said around 40, you're probably pretty close. And what about the third image? Well, again, it's more than 50%, so it's probably going to be around 60. What percent of this image do you think is represented by the blue shading? Now, it would be easy to represent this as a fraction because you can see that 3 out of the 4 squares or rectangles are blue. So we could represent it as 3/4. But now we want to represent it as a percent. In order to represent it as a percent, we have to have it out of 100. And our fraction right now is not out of 100, so we have to convert it so that it is out of 100. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to have a fraction that has a denominator of 100. And you have to think to yourself, what would you multiply by 4 to get 100? Because this is how we get equivalent fractions. A little bit of mental math might lead you to 4 times 25 is 100. Now, because we multiplied the denominator by 25, to have an equivalent fraction, we need to multiply the numerator by 25 as well. So 3 times 25 is 75. So we now have a fraction, an equivalent fraction, that has a denominator of 100. It's out of 100. So we can represent it with a percent. So the blue shaded area has a value of 75% in this image. In this example, you see that there are 8 rectangles shaded yellow out of 10, and you can represent that as the fraction 8/10. In order to represent it as a percent, we need to change that fraction so it is out of 100. So again, think about your denominator of 100. What are you going to multiply by 10 to get 100, an equivalent fraction? So you would multiply 10 times 10. multiply the numerator also by 10 to get 80. And that's an equivalent fraction. Now that we have our fraction out of 100, it's easy to express it as a percent. 80%, the yellow shaded area represents 80% of the whole part. So it's easy to convert a fraction that has a denominator of 100 to a percent, but if it doesn't have a denominator of 100, you might need to convert it to an equivalent fraction first. But you should be able to convert percents to decimals to fractions and all the combinations with those three different types of representation.